Socrates said an unexamined life is not worth living, which would imply an examined life is worth living. C.S. Lewis said good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. We live in a world full of bad ideas, and ideas have consequences. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you have not already, like, subscribe, and share this podcast with family and friends, a show where we examine life contained with philosophies, ideas, and their consequences on today's culture. I am Rainer Thermal, and this is Hey Culture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Hey Culture. I'm really excited about today's episode. On today's episode, we have Dr. Kristen Davis, somebody who not just dabbles, but could be seen as an expert in multiple fields. So what I'm excited about is for the first time, we're going to do like a different bio with each episode as to how she got interested in each of these different disciplines. But before we get into that, Dr. Kristen, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with you guys today.
I'm also excited about that. Just a bit of background for the audience. Where we met was at the Rocha Christi conference last year, where I actually saw two of your talks in Pretoria, and then you came and taught at the Bible College after that conference and this year as well. So I'm really excited to dive a bit deeper into some of these topics.
Yeah, I love coming in and helping in South Africa. It's been great being able to help with Apologetics SA and Ratio Christi.
Yeah, we do appreciate you. Without a further ado, as today we're going to speak about the archaeological evidence for the Old Testament, tell us a bit more about yourself, also why and how did you get into this discipline? Why does it interest you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It goes into my testimony actually a little bit. So I was raised in church and Christian school. I had about as much God and Jesus as you could get. But I still somehow missed the boat. I don't know exactly how that happened, but I wasn't convinced that Christianity was true. I remember standing in my grandmother's living room after watching like a History Channel or Discovery Channel TV show about other religions and thinking, well, Christianity is the most exclusive. I have to be good in all of them, but I also have to believe in Jesus and Christianity. So I'll stick with that because I'll probably be good enough for whatever heaven actually is the case if I'm wrong. And so obviously that doesn't have any staying power. And so when I went away to college, I fell away not because anybody challenged my faith, but just because it wasn't fun to live by the Christian standard and I wanted to fit in. And I realized looking back later, that was because I wasn't actually grounded. I wasn't actually convinced that Christianity was true. So fast forward, I had loved my Bible classes in Christian school. And so I ended up in a season in my life where I signed up to take a biblical archaeology class and a creation science class at a Christian university. And that was like a game changer for me. And it answered all the questions that I didn't even know that I had about the Bible and its reliability and whether I could trust it and all of those kinds of things. And so my passion for biblical archaeology actually was birthed out of that. It was a faith saver for me. And the more convinced I became that the Bible was trustworthy historically, the more I could trust the non-historical claims. And so that was kind of the beginning of how I ended up on this path for archaeology.
That's pretty amazing. What Christian university did you attend when you took these subjects?
Yeah, so this was my undergrad, so it was Liberty University out of Lynchburg, Virginia. I did it online, and then I didn't get enough from them that I continued and got a master's of arts in Christian apologetics from Biola, which is out in California. I did that online too. And then a couple of years ago, I finished up my PhD in philosophy of religion from Southern Evangelical Seminary. So, yeah.
Wow, that is quite the repertoire. But so what you're basically saying is with the biblical evidence is that because the historical facts can be proven within the Bible, you can trust the theological stuff in the Bible as well.
100%. So what I mean by that is, for example, I focus mostly on the Old Testament because there's a lot more controversy over whether those events actually happened. But one in the New Testament would be the resurrection of Jesus. So that Jesus was crucified by the Romans in Israel at a specific time in history. All of those things are historically verifiable pieces of information. But the implications of his death, burial, and resurrection for us and what that means in reconciling us to God is a theological claim. And so if the historical claim is true, then we can trust the theological claim. But if we are kind of squishy on whether or not we can believe the historical claims, that's when people start getting uncomfortable with the things that you have to take on faith, like the theology.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So why then specifically the Old Testament, or did you dabble in the New Testament evidence as well?
No, actually, I mostly focus in terms of archaeology on the Old Testament because it was the most contested. In terms of the history, the New Testament isn't really contested. But the further back you go in the Old Testament, the more people claim that it was fiction or not, created for later, like political purposes. So, for example, I really love focusing on the patriarchs because they are actually the most contested group. It's claimed by critical historians that they were a fictional creation of the post-exilic Israelites. So the people from the 400 to 800s BC, they wanted to have this reason that they should be allowed to retake this land after coming out of the Assyrian exile. And so they created these people who had a historical root in the patriarchs in order to give them a validity for taking this land over. So that's kind of the argument that's made, which is that these, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob weren't real historical people. And so we lose a ton of what we understand about Christianity, what God is trying to do, if the Pentateuch isn't real history. And so for me, it was really important to go all the way back to the beginning, because if the beginning of the book isn't historically reliable, why are we reading the rest of it?
Yeah, that makes total sense, and I think maybe let's start there. Let's dive into the patriarchs then first. How do we know that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were real people?
Yeah, I think that some of that comes from the specific details that we see in the narratives. So, for example, one of the things that we look at, like if we're looking at Abraham, we can look at the details from his life story, the historically verifiable points, and see if they correspond with ancient Near Eastern history. So, for example, what we know about Abraham is that he lived around the 1800s. He is from Ur. His family then moves on to Haran. He was planning to move on to Canaan, but then they stop in Haran. Later, he moves on to Canaan, and then he moves to Egypt. And so if you look at that, and it might seem completely abstract and indifferent, doesn't matter. But when you overlay that with the historical details from the ancient Near Eastern culture at that time, you end up finding that the area where Abraham comes from Ur, at the period of time before he lived there, it was like a major metropolitan area. So it was the equivalent of like New York here in the United States. And so it was the place to be. But then there became a significant amount of political unrest. There was a lot of nomads and different kings coming in trying to take control. In addition to that, there were some economic conditions and some agricultural conditions that shifted that made it impossible to produce wheat and barley. And so Abraham's father was responsible for a significant number of people, right? We know that it wasn't just like a core family of like 5. It was a massive number of people, because that same group of people, when they go with Abraham to Canaan, are able to defeat 5 kings to rescue Lot. Okay, so we have Abraham's family is responsible for a large number of people. So it would make sense why, if there's political and economic unrest, why his father might uproot them and move them away from Ur. And then what we have in Haran is there's a significant trade route in this area. They don't have the political unrest. They don't have the agricultural issues. And so it makes sense why they might have stopped there rather than going on to Canaan, which Canaan was like a backwater area, not as developed. And so when you get away from the immediate problems, it makes sense why you might want to stay there. Some other details that we have in relation to Abraham is he moves on to Canaan, and then there is a famine. And so as a result, he and his family goes on to Egypt. And in Egypt, they go there for relief. Well, the question is, was there the kind of interaction between Canaan and Egypt that would explain why Abraham would go, and if this was a legitimate kind of place where he would go to seek relief? what we end up finding in that archaeological record in Egypt is that there's a painting called the Beni Hassan tomb painting, which is a painting of interactions between what they call the Asiatics, or the people from Canaan, and the land of Egypt, that was significant enough between these two groups that it was preserved for all of eternity in a governor's tomb. And so there was this interaction that the biblical historical narrative parallels and clarifies. But I think that some of the other really cool details that are probably my personal favorite have to do with little fine details that you couldn't get right if you were making the story up over 1,000 years later. And so two examples of that would have to be with the city of Shechem. So in Genesis 12, Abraham comes through to the place of Shechem, to the tree of Moreh, and it's, he sets up camp and he does this thing there. Two generations later, 20 chapters later, roughly like 200 years, so not that huge of a gap historically, his grandson comes through, and it doesn't mention that it mentions that there is a city there at that time. So interestingly, what we find in the archaeological records is that when Abraham would have come through, there had been a city before he came through. Around the period of time he would have come through, that city had been destroyed, so there would have been no city for him to find. But about 200 years later, the city is rebuilt, and so there would have been a city for his grandson to find. And so this is the kind of thing that people making up a story 1,000 years after the fact wouldn't have had that fine level of detail to be able to say there was a city, it was destroyed, and then at this time it wasn't. And we see things like this throughout the scriptures. Yeah.
That makes total sense. When you say his grandson, is it Jacob?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. That's pretty cool. Is there any, with Isaac specifically, anything regarding Isaac specifically?
Not that I can think of offhand. That doesn't mean that that's the case. I can think of another one that spans like Joseph. So,
Okay.
So if we look at the slave prices throughout the ancient Near East, so slavery was a terrible thing, but the reality was it was very prominent in the ancient world, and it was very well documented. And so when we look at the documentation of the slave prices throughout the ancient culture and compare them with biblical records of slave prices, we actually end up seeing that they exactly match for the day. So different slave prices ranged over the period of about a 500-year, probably more than that. Yeah, about a 500-year period. They go anywhere from 10 silver shekels all the way up to 120 silver shekels. And so we see inflation, and we see specific data points through that 500-year period of time. And so we see the inflation happening with slave prices increasing. And every time we insert one of the biblical records in relation to that into the historical timeline, it exactly matches for the day. So for example, when Joseph is sold into slavery for 20 shekels of silver, that's accurate. When Moses discusses compensation to a master for the death of a slave in Exodus, that's accurate for the period of time as well. And when King Menahem taxes the people of Israel 50 shekels of silver in 2 Kings, that's accurate for the day as well. And so that's a really interesting, like, fine detail that covers not only some of the patriarchs, but even into the period of the kings.
Wow, that's amazing. Just to contextualize that for the audience, is if somebody had to make it up, they would have had to keep track with inflation and the economic situation.
That would be like it would be like trying to accurately guess the price of milk 1,000 years ago.
You're like, it's crazy. And also, and when not just keeping track of the price, but keeping track of what happens there geographically and geopolitically. No, it's just mind-boggling. So you've tackled now the patriarchal period, and so where we left off with Joseph is we find the Israelites now within Egypt. Can we then shift about 400 years later? Or firstly, is there evidence of the Israelites being in Egypt as slaves?
I think that while it's not overt evidence, there is a lot of details in the Egyptian record that when you parallel them with the Israel or the biblical narrative, they make more sense. So a couple of details that I find interesting, and there's been so much more since I did my research on this. But I think that like King Amenhotep II is a good example. He, I think, is the best candidate for being the pharaoh of the Exodus. It's contested. There are a couple of different views on who it is. But if you look at his life events and parallel them with the biblical narrative, there are some weird things about his life that make more sense when you couple it up. For example, Egypt was a major military might before him. And his father was very well feared in the area. And then when he comes and takes over, he only has 2 military campaigns. The first one is very brutal, and it seems to be to squelch a revolt that takes place after his father's death. So it's him trying to like establish his reign. And he is so vicious in this that when he sails back into the city of Thebes, he hangs the bodies of several of the chiefs that he conquers off the front of his ship as he sails back into Thebes. So this is a very like confrontational, powerful like move that's taking place here. Then he only has one other military campaign, and there's a lot of like weird things about it. So for example, it starts at the wrong time of year. So it starts in November, which is the beginning of the cold and the rainy season in that area, versus when kings would normally go to wars in April. It's very short. He goes just into the south of Palestine, which is the Israel area. He goes very low into that area to interact with people in that area, but Egypt's conflicts were actually further above Palestine with the Syrians. And so he's not even combating people that Egypt would be expected to combat with. In addition to that, what we see coming back with him is gold and silver and chariots, all the kinds of things that we actually see going out with the Israelites. So it almost sounds like they're trying to restock their stores after they've lost a significant amount of things. And in this particular military campaign, they bring back 46 times more slaves than in any other campaign, all the other campaigns combined in Egypt. They bring back 100,000 slaves as a result of this particular campaign. And then after this, they go to peace treaties, and he doesn't make any more war for the rest of his campaign or the rest of his time. Which all of this, it's odd. But if you parallel it with the biblical narrative, where you have an entire slave population of 2,000 or 2 million people leaving, taking a ton of your goods with them, and then that's basically your slave force. And so as a result, you need to restock your stores, you need to restock your workforce, and you need to save face with all of your enemies that you have, all of your slaves have just walked out the door. That might give your enemies the impression that you're vulnerable for attack if your entire army was just obliterated in the Red Sea. So it looks interesting, but when you parallel it with the biblical narrative, it makes more sense. There's one other person around that period of time that I think highlights well in relation to the Exodus narrative, and that's Queen Hatshepsut. There's some reasons to believe that she was probably the one who adopted Moses as a baby into the Pharaoh's court. A couple of reasons would be, first of all, that she was the only Pharaoh's daughter at the appropriate period of time to live to adulthood to be able to actually do that. But in addition to that, 20 years after her death, all of the imagery and writings and all of the things about her are obliterated. Now, if you understand Egyptian mythology, one of the things about their mythology is if you can erase someone from this earth, in terms of getting rid of all the images of them, writings about them, and everything about them, if you can obliterate them from here, then you obliterate their soul in the afterlife. And so it's interesting that this happens 20 years after her death. It's not immediate. Some argue that the reason it happened was because her successor didn't like that he had to follow a woman in the monarchy. But that doesn't make sense to wait such a great amount of time to do this. But it does make sense why you would want to give somebody a fate worse than death if that person is responsible for bringing the person who just killed your entire army and took your entire slave force and all of your belongings out of Egypt. So if she is in fact the woman who adopted Moses, who became the leader of this huge, catastrophic event in Egypt, it would make sense why you would want to obliterate her from the afterlife significantly after she had actually passed away.
Oh, that is really compelling. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I think it's a recent discovery, but I haven't delved deeply enough into it to really fact check it. But it was on, I think, the Blessed God podcast. Wes Huff was a guest on there as well. So I think they're quite reputable. But he was speaking about in a recent discovery in one of the tombs, they also found what they believe to be the firstborn son of the pharaoh who died with the final plague. Okay. And some of the reasons why I think it is with the embalmment, it looks like first of all, what they find is the boils of one of the other plagues. It looks like that they could actually see that on the skin. And also, which I found strange, is that they could see in the tomb that the son is buried before the father is buried, meaning the son died well before the father actually died. So that's interesting. I don't know if you knew about that, but as I said, I also didn't see how well attested it is.
Yeah, that one, I haven't heard about that one, but I haven't been looking into recent discoveries all that much lately. There's actually a ton of evidence, and more keeps coming out. They've found, I'm trying to think the details. They've found sites around Egypt in the areas that were specified as having been given to the Israelites that seem to imply that there was some foreign group of people from the land of Canaan that lived there. So there's a lot of like Israelite kind of names showing in different servant records throughout Egyptian. So there's a lot of like details that, if you're willing to look at them as a collective whole, support the biblical narrative. But some people who like to object to the idea of the Exodus having taken place, their reason for doing so is that they don't see an explicit record in Egypt that Egypt was, of the Exodus taking place. And they said, well, this is such a huge historical event. Why wouldn't it be in their historical record? Well, because kings during that period of time didn't record their failures. That they were, especially the Pharaoh, he was considered God personified. And so for him to fail would be absolutely blasphemous. And so they would obliterate any, they didn't record anything in relation to their failures. So it would actually be odd for us to see the Exodus written out in some historical document in the Egyptian timeline.
That makes a lot of sense. So now we've covered the exilic period. So can we maybe shift over just a bit to the time of the judges? Is there any evidence for the conquest time?
Yeah. I think that there's a good amount. So some of the details that I can think of that I like to talk about. So the first one has to do with Jericho. So there was some controversy over whether or not there was actually a city there for Joshua to conquer. Joshua 6 is where this is talked about, and we get some historical details about that. It was a very short siege, 6 days long. They were supposed to walk around the city once a day for 6 days, and then on the last day, or the 7th day, they were to shout, blow their horns. The walls fell down. They were supposed to go in and burn everything, so not take any of it out with them. And then, except for the gold, they were supposed to take to the tabernacle. And so that gives us information to compare to the site. So what we actually have at the site was, there's been some controversy depending upon which archaeologist you talk to on whether or not the city was inhabited during the period of time when Joshua would have come through. But I think we have good reasons to believe that there was. The first thing we see at the site is that we see that there was a collapsed wall. We see that there are food stores that were left inside the city after whatever took place in this destruction that were burned and left. And so all of this is exactly what we would expect to see if the Israelites had, in fact, been the conquerors. Why? Because we expected to see the collapsed wall. But in addition to that, when a people group conquered another people group, they would usually take all their provisions for themselves. They wouldn't burn it and leave it there. But that's actually what we find. We find full jars of grain that were burned and left there, which is exactly what would be expected because the Israelites were expected to do that. In addition to that, it was a very short siege. Some have argued that it was the Egyptians who actually may have caused this destruction layer. However, the Egyptians were very patient individuals, and so they would show up at a city, and they would come right before the harvest when there was barely any food in the city for provision. They would sit there, and we have records of them waiting up to 3 years for a city to starve to death and give up before they would come in and conquer. But they would show up before the harvest when all the food was still in the fields. The armies would then have food, the people in the cities would not, and they would just wait them out. What we find here, though, is this took place after the harvest. All the food's in the city. And the people group, it was a short siege because they didn't eat all the food. It was there to be burned. So it parallels what we would expect. But in addition to that, some of the things that make it seem as though there was, in fact, actually a populated city, that destruction layer is at the appropriate time for the conquest to have taken place, is the pottery and some scarabs that we find there. So one of the ways they date layers in an archaeological site to be able to understand what period of time the data they're pulling from that layer actually happened is based off the pottery that they find in that layer. So I'm not sure if you guys have an equivalent to this in South Africa, but in the United States, in the White House, there's a room called I think it's called the China Room. And essentially it has all these different China patterns from every different first lady through the entire American history. Okay. And if you look at it, you can see there's distinctions for each of the different periods of time. So you can see like the Revolutionary War period of China is different from the 1970s period of China, which is different from 25's period of China. So you can see that it matches the culture of the day. So that's kind of what we're talking about here when we're talking about pottery layers. They have certain pottery layers that are pottery that is found in each layer, and they can date that layer. So there's local pottery that you would expect to have been made at the location, but there's also imported pottery. And so part of the controversy over whether or not this site was dated to this destruction layer was dated to Joshua was over this imported pottery that was expected to be found there. And it was actually found by Garstang, which is the first person who excavated. It was re-identified as accurately being there by Bryant Woods of Associates for Biblical Research. And the person who said that it was lacking and wasn't there, actually, it was in her notes. She just miscategorized it. So she actually has pictures of the pottery she says is missing for why this site should not be dated to the period of time. So it's Cypriotic and Mycenaean imported pottery. It would have come from the Cyprus, the Greco-Roman area of the world, so across the Mediterranean and then carted over to Jericho. But a second thing that we have that kind of points to the idea that the Israelites were in fact, or there wasn't actually a populated city at this period of time, are scarabs that are found in the cemetery. So we have scarabs there that are in the tombs of people who were buried, and the scarabs are from the 1300s all the way up to the 1500s. And so what the conquest would have taken place around in the 1400s. And so what we find at this site is people are continually being buried from the 1300s to the 1500s. And so you don't go bury your dead in someone else's city, you bury it in your own. And so there was a populated city that is evidenced by continued tombs being populated for that 200-year period when the conquest would have been right smack in the middle of that.
Wow. That once again, that's amazing. Okay, so that's the period of the judges. Now in terms of Israel's history and in terms of the Old Testament, we move into the United Monarchy under Saul and David. What's the evidence like for the United Kingdom of Israel?
Yeah, so that one's different and that one's interesting. There is a lot of contesting over whether or not David was a real person because of the influence that he has in scripture, and they assume that we would expect to see significantly more around him. The question is whether or not the tribes would have united at that point in time in history. They don't necessarily think that that's an appropriate historical observation, but there is one detail that I think is really interesting. It's not overwhelming, and it would be nice to have more evidence of David than we do. But at the site of Tel Dan, which is the site where the tribe of Dan ended up settling, at that site, they actually found in a secondary use in a wall a piece of what is called a victory stela. So a victory stela would be this large stone monument that would have been set up in the middle of a city or town after that city or town had been conquered by the conquering people group, making clear who this people now paid homage to. So this particular victory stela, it had at some point in time been broken and used in a wall. And so a piece of it was found. And in that piece, it says that this particular king of Aram was boasting victory over the king of Israel of the house of David. Now, this is interesting because the dating of this piece of victory stela was from roughly the 800s. And during that period of time, that's within 150 years of when the Bible says that David had his monarchy. So what we actually see in this record is that within 150 years of the Davidic monarchy, there is a monarchy from his lineage that is prominent enough for a foreign king to boast victory over. And so there is support for the idea that David was not a fictional character, that he was in fact a person who had a monarchy that then extended well beyond his life and had influence well beyond just the local peoples of Israel.
Okay. But once again, so now we don't have kings recording their own failures, but the fact that this king recorded his victories, actually that helps us a lot. How about the divided kingdom and also the time, the divided kingdom pre-exile?
Yeah, so I think there's not a whole lot of contesting over the historical events during the period of the prophet's exile and the return. But there are, when I look at that, when I look at the details in relation to this, it's less trying to prove that those events are historically reliable and more showing how that the Bible corresponds with historical events or is illuminated by historical events. Because as we transition into the divided period and the exile, people are less argumentative over whether those historical details are actually accurate. But I think that there's some interesting things that we see there. So in the site that I was just talking to you about, the site of Tel Dan, where the tribe of Dan would have settled, we see some interesting things that kind of start from the conquest that overlap into the period of the exile. And so what we actually see with this particular site, it's one of the most excavated sites. I think it's been excavated continuously for about 40 years. They have found so many things there. But what we end up seeing is that there was a people group who were really wealthy and that were not Israelite. We see religious markers that make it clear that they were worshiping, Canaanite gods or Egyptian gods. That people group is destroyed. A new people group moves in, and that new people group is semi-nomadic. And the reason that we know that people group is semi-nomadic is because of the fact that they, the way they live, they live in tents, they don't build infrastructure, and they build these pits to store their jars and their belongings in, which is an indicator of semi-nomadic people group. We see it all over Israel during this period of time at lots of different sites. These people do not have any religious markers in this particular area, which is important because the Israelites were not supposed to worship at any site other than Shiloh, and then later when the temple was built in Jerusalem. And so then that people group in the period of the exile, or the prophets before the exile, what we see is that same people group that have moved in have now started to settle. But the things that we start to see are distinctly Israelite in nature, in terms especially of their religious kind of persuasion. So in 1 Kings 12, after Solomon passes away, his son Rehoboam is not liked by the people. Jeroboam, the leader of the labor, decides to split off, and we get the divided kingdom. The 10 tribes go with Jeroboam. Rehoboam stays behind with Judah. And as a result of Jeroboam being afraid that if people continue to worship at Jerusalem, they will return and reunite the monarchy. So instead, he sets up 2 golden calves. One of those golden calves is at this site of Dan. And so what we actually see is there is what they call a bamaha, or high place. We see in scripture the high place where people would go to high places to worship. So this is one of those high places, is set up at the site of Dan. It pre-existed Israel. So it's been a long-standing throughout Canaanite period high place and worship place. But at this period of time, we see distinctly Israelite implements that show up in the worship. So if you look at there was a piece of a large four-horned altar that's found. There's a tiny, small four-horned incense altar. If you look at the details about these, they match the Israelite kind of altar that is described in the building of the tabernacle and the temple. If you look at the implements, the altar toolkits, so the bowls, the shovels, all of the kinds of things, those that were found there are distinctly Israelite in flavor. They match what we see being described in the temple and the tabernacle. And then there's one set of incense shovels that show up at this particular site. That the only other place we find them in the historical record at all is over 1,100 years later in Jewish synagogue artwork. So it's very distinctly like Jewish in nature. And so what we see here is it seems that the historical narrative or the historical details parallel the historical narrative in the Bible in relation to this division in the United Monarchy. Some other things that we have from the exilic and post-exilic period, actually they're during before the exilic period, are like corroboration that takes place between the Bible and ancient Near Eastern historical sources. So one example is the Assyrian king Sennacherib. So he comes to conquer a variety of different cities in Israel. And so one of the ones that he ends up sieging is the city of Lachish in 2 Kings 18 and 2 Chronicles 32. And so we don't get a whole lot of detail. It's kind of just given a one or two verses in those passages. We don't get a lot of detail of what happens. But actually, if you go to Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh, he has a frieze, which is a painting kind of like carved out in clay that was put up on the wall in his palace in Nineveh. That was actually like a snapshot of what happened at that city. So we actually get insight into some of the historical details and the cruelty of the Assyrians on that particular city of Lachish. That's really kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely is interesting. And even though it's not something that is being contested, I think just the fact that we can show that the Bible still corroborates these parts of history, I think overall it just gives this overwhelming argument actually for Scripture. How about the exilic period? Do we have evidence showing that the Israelites went, or the Judeans went to Babylon, or maybe just the fact that Scripture accurately records who was in power during that time?
So interesting. That's not something I've put a ton of research into. So I haven't looked into whether we have evidence in those different sites, so in Babylon or Assyria, for the Israelites. I do think that there is credibility that is lent in the fact that the names of the kings and the events kind of parallel. I do think, if I recall, I remember hearing about there being like part of what we see in some of the return prophets. So like in Ezra, there's mention of the fact that there was decrees put out by these kings to allow them to come back to provide provisions. I feel like I did see an article at one point that kind of attested that some of those had been found, but I don't remember the details on them because that wasn't something that I was trying to defend, unfortunately.
No, I understand.
But one thing I think would be just a fun thing to point out to your readers is a lot of the stuff you guys can see yourself. Like if you were to go to Israel, you can actually walk through the pages of Scripture. And so like one from the exilic period is Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem. For those of you who like may or may not be aware of that, part of when Sennacherib was coming and trying to conquer all of Israel, he comes and he is planning to siege Jerusalem. And the water source for Jerusalem is actually outside the city wall. So if in a siege situation, they wouldn't last very long inside the city. And so King Hezekiah has them chisel through the stone that the city sits on to bring the spring source inside. And it's pretty amazing, the miraculous like story that they managed to pull it off in time and all that kind of stuff. But that's actually still there today. You can actually go walk through Hezekiah's tunnel and experience like what would have, the circumstances that they were working through to be able to save the city.
I didn't realize that. I've read that part of Scripture a couple of times. I always thought this was an escape tunnel.
Yeah, no, it was to bring the water source inside the city wall into one of the pools that's there today. I don't remember what the pool is, but the interesting thing was like they were on a short timeline, so they start cutting from both sides. And then they had to, while they had engineering and knew how to do things in the appropriate angles, they were kind of like at the crunch. And so the fact that they managed to get all the angles right and managed to meet in the middle in a very like condensed timeline, and then the water comes and shifts inside to the pool and then they, covered it up from the outside so it wasn't obvious for Sennacherib to be able to find it.
That's amazing.
Yeah. It's
So
very
we've
cold.
very cold.
Yeah, if you walk through it, it's like ice water.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So we've walked through basically from Genesis up until Malachi and covered bits and pieces of evidence showing or that corroborates different eras of the Old Testament and Israel's history. And you did it all just like from memory, meaning that this wasn't a uh, a talk that you gave at a seminary, like here's all the slides and evidence. So that's just to show the audience as well that that's just what you can recall, like the
Yeah.
abundance out there that they can go and look at, and I implore the audience to if this interests you, do a deep dive. Like
Mhm.
I think it will definitely amaze you.
So one thing that I think is really important to point out is when people argue that the Bible is not historically reliable because X hasn't been found, whatever they put in that blank. One of 90% of what existed in antiquity was lost in antiquity. And so we only have about 10% for us to discover. And of that, only about 1% of it has actually been uncovered and researched. So what do I mean by that? Like if your house, think about your house. If today your house burned down and was destroyed and you were just like, forget it, I'm just going to move somewhere else and just left it there for 2,000 years, what of your life would be left for people to actually uncover to learn about you? And then on top of that, what we've actually found, there's lack of funding, lack of licensing, lack of just people who have, bodies to do the research and the digging. And so there's tons of stuff that we know is out there because we have scans or whatnot. So we know it's in the earth or is sitting in storerooms that there's just not enough archaeologists who can, research what has been discovered. And so just because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because we haven't found something about someone yet or some event yet does not prove that that event doesn't happen or didn't happen.
That reminds me. I think I heard this from you during your talk at the conference last year. Isn't there a people group that was long contested that this people group didn't exist and the Bible made it up, and
Yes.
then recently they've discovered this people group?
Yes. So that would be the Hittites. So the Hittites are mentioned over 47 times throughout the Old Testament. They span the entire. So we've got Abraham building his burial cave from Ephraim the Hittite. One of Esau's wives was the daughter of a Hittite. We have it from Genesis all the way through Ezekiel. These people groups are mentioned. And so it was claimed that these were not a real historical people. We didn't have any record of them outside the scriptures. So they were made up in order to have this conflict with Israel. But we have a huge historical issue if they span the entire scriptures or mention this many times and aren't real. But in 1906, Hugo Winkler was excavating at a site outside of Turkey, and what he found was that this was actually the Hittite capital of Hattusha, and they had been a major military might in their day that rivaled Egypt. And they found 5 temples, a fortified citadel, numerous monumental inscriptions, over 10,000 clay tablets that had been burnt and therefore preserved. And when those were translated, it became very clear that these were real people and they were real players in the geopolitics that were taking place at that time. So it's fascinating because the Bible had access to history before secular historians did.
That's amazing. I think that just drives the point home beautifully. What would you recommend for the audience after we went through like this rundown of Israel's history? What would you recommend for let's say, for example, we have a young adult or teenager that has heard from school or in university a lot of criticism with regards to Christianity and the Bible specifically, and which causes a little bit of doubt to seep in, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so my first encouragement would be, do not be afraid to dig in. Do not be afraid to go research the answers to your questions. Because every time the Bible has been pressed, it always turns out to be factually accurate. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to find stuff on the internet from people who disagree and try to uncover it. But if you keep pressing and go to credible people and credible sites, then you will find legitimate and trustworthy sources that will show that the Bible is historically reliable. And what do I mean by that? There are people who have no professional experience in the area that they're talking about that make claims about the reliability of scripture or about Christianity or whatnot, but they're not authorities in those areas. Now, I am not an archaeologist, so I am taking what professional archaeologists has uncovered, but I am an apologist. I have been trained in apologetics. I have been trained in philosophy of religion. I've been trained in how to analyze data in relation to religion for credibility or not. I depend on the historical or the accuracy of the archaeologist data in order to make the claims that I do. And so some of the credible sources that I would recommend are Associates for Biblical Research is one. Their website is biblearcheology.org. So they are very conservative in terms of their view. They use the scriptures for their archaeological endeavors, and they are an archaeology organization focusing on defending the scriptures. There are other archaeology organizations that interact with biblical concepts and biblical events who are not necessarily, who are kind of bent towards disbelief in the scriptures. But some of those have more funding. And so they actually discover more things. But you have to be aware of people's presuppositions before you necessarily listen to their conclusions. So someone might find something and then say that it means this, but before you take meaning from someone, I would just do some more research to make sure that you should be taking the conclusions that they make based off the evidence they find first. So some good resources would be biblearcheology.org. Titus Kennedy has a couple of different books. He's a professionally trained archaeologist, digs in Israel, but he also has an apologetic focus. So he has several. And if you're interested in the New Testament, he has, I think he has one that's specifically focused on Jesus and archaeology that supports that. And then another book that's kind of short that is very apologetic in focus is The Stones Cry Out by Randall Price. That one is very interesting because a lot of the archaeology books that you can get are more focused on, let me just paint the world of Israel, not necessarily let me use the archaeology to defend the scriptures. And while those are good and valuable to help you get a picture, it's also helpful to do what I've done today, which is like to make a case based off archaeology for the reliability of scripture. And so that's one of the things that Randall Price's book, The Stones Cry Out, does, is he's doing an apologetic. He's also a professional archaeologist as well.
Thank you for that. And then if the audience would like to know more about your ministry or your social media and so forth, where could they find you?
Yes. So if you have any questions or I didn't cover something today and you want a resource, my website is doubtlessfaith.com. So doubtlessfaith.com. And you can reach me there. You can send me an email through my contact form, and I'm happy to give you resources to things if you have further questions.
Thank you very much. We are going to record another episode a bit later, which the two episodes, like usual, is 2 weeks out of each other. But for the end of this episode, Dr. Kristen, thank you for speaking to me about Old Testament. And it's not really goodbye for now because we'll see each other again. But for the audience, this was A Culture. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you for watching and or listening to Hey Culture, a podcast that wants to shine a light in the darkness. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, share, and ring that notification bell. On Apple and Spotify, please review and rate this podcast. I'm Renner Fermor, and this is High Culture.